A lot of them are from our own collection. We have a collection of over 18,000 pieces, so not all of them are out at once, but some of them are, like I said, rarely, if not ever, before seen. So hello again, welcome. Hopefully you can hear me this time. I promised the crowd inside here that I will not repeat myself, but know that online, our online guests, you've been welcomed and invited to stay with us and come and join Tudor Place for a host of activities coming up throughout the year. So tonight we're digging into America's Story Lives Here, focusing on the incredible story of Sister Gertrude Wightt and how she left one world and made her mark in a few others. And so she is the runaway nun who walked out of her convent just a few blocks from here and put on a different hat, first as a Washington socialite, and then as a political insider. And so we'll hear a lot more about that, but we are really proud that of the long history of pioneering, daring women firsts that are part of the fabric of Tudor Place. And we are delighted and proud of the fact that Sister Gertrude Wightt found both a friend and a home here at Tudor Place. And so Dr. Joseph Mannard is here to tell us her story. This is the first time her full biography has been told. And this is his first full-length biography that has been published. So lots of firsts going on here. And Dr. Mannard is an associate professor of history at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, a renowned scholar of early America, American women, and in particular, women religious figures. And we were just chatting, and Dr. Mannard let me know that he first met Gertrude Wightt back in the 80s when he was doing his doctoral research, and she haunted him, if you will, or her mystery unraveled over the course of decades. And so he's here tonight to share more about her story with us. So without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Joseph Mannard.
Oh, yes, sorry. Thank you all. What I'm doing tonight is I'm not going to try to tell you the whole story of Gertrude Wightt. I couldn't, but I am going to focus on her post-convent years after she left the convent, especially the years at Tudor Place, where she officially resided from 1854 to 1867 when she died. In the Q&A afterwards, if anybody wants to know more about her convent years, I'd be glad to talk about that too. But for matters of time and focus, I simply can't cover everything tonight. Okay, so. Hold it down here. Okay, so Berard had previously known of this woman only as an escaped nun, which was kind of generally known in Washington at the time, no longer throughout the country. Her time as an escaped nun was 1831, so this is much later. But her legend, if you want to call it that, lived on locally. The two women took to each other so much that they agreed to meet the following Saturday when there was going to be a tour of the White House. When they get to the White House, Anne Gertrude sends up her calling card, and this is it's kind of faint, but it says Miss Wightt on it. Hopefully you can see it right there. And they arrived there. It was still morning, late morning, so she sent her card up to Franklin Pierce because they were afraid that he might not have time for them right then. But he came down immediately, and after sending that card up, this kind of shows you that she could make even the leading politician in the country at the time, the president, pay attention to her. So he comes down, and then they talk to him, and Burrard talks about the debate she had witnessed in Congress the day before, and he talks to Anne Gertrude Wightt about some local politics happening in the House. Then he takes them on a tour of the White House, a personal tour. Okay. So who is this Anne Gertrude Wightt person that she gets the attention of the President of the United States? And admittedly, in those days, it was a little easier to do that, perhaps, than it is today. But still, it's surprising in many ways. Here's some questions I want to answer in this talk then. How was she able to transition so easily from being a cloistered nun, living in the cloister even as a child from the time she was 8, as a boarding student, to when she left, she was about 32. Okay, so she spent a good 3/4 of her life in the convent. And then she moves into this field known as parlor politics, of women wheeling and dealing behind the scenes outside of the official channels to get things done in Washington. What personal and societal factors allowed her to gain acceptance so easily? Because from the Catholic point of view, what she had done was a scandal. It brought public scandal on the church. That wasn't the way most prominent people in Washington saw it, though, as we'll see. Thirdly, from whom did she learn the art of and practice of parlor politics? And I'll define what that is in just a minute. Who are some of the people that Wightt sought to assist as well, politically and financially, through her political contacts and what came to be known as her influence? Okay. On condition of her being dispensed from living in the convent back in 1831, Wightt had agreed to keep her vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience while living in the world, but not being of the world. Did she remain a Catholic? Did she keep her vows? The quick answer is no to the first, and yes to chastity. Okay, so this is a drawing of Georgetown Visitation Convent around 1822 when she was a member. This is when she was just starting to move up in the ranks. She was what was called a counselor to the superior when she was 23 years old, and the next youngest member on the council was 46. So she very quickly, because she had also gone there as a student, they tapped her as somebody with talent. Also, her younger sister took over the books of the place, and she was also a nun. When she leaves the convent in 1831, and as I said, that's a whole other story, she goes to the home of her first cousin. And her first cousin was Marcia Burns Van Ness, and she's married to John Peter Van Ness, who was the mayor of the city. If you're a Washingtonian, you may know that Marcia Burns Van Ness was a very wealthy heiress because her father sold most of the land that became the District of Columbia. And so she was also one of these political wives of this revolutionary generation, the first generation. And among her friends were people like Margaret Bayard Smith and Dolley Madison. She's also the first cousin of Anne Gertrude Wightt. So that's why Wightt goes there. And then 8 months after she leaves the convent, she's more repentant or penitent. And this is a copy of the dispensation that the Archbishop of Baltimore, because DC was part of Baltimore at the Archdiocese at the time, he granted her 8 months after she left to the day. And this is after consulting with Rome about her case, because she is the first vowed woman to just leave without asking for dispensation. Okay, so this is a copy of the original that I found in special collections in Georgetown. Now, she's out of the convent, and even before, a few weeks before she got that dispensation, I have a quote from Margaret Bayard Smith, who was really one of the cultural arbiters of Washington at the time. She was one of those women who shunned Peggy Eaton, the second wife of the Secretary of War. And if you know about Jacksonian politics, this led to the dismissal of the cabinet when the cabinet wives would not accept her, because her scandal was sexual. And that was 2 years before, or at least alleged to be sexual, right? That she and John Eaton had married or had spent time together before her first husband had died mysteriously on a ship. So I found it very interesting that Margaret Bayard Smith, 2 years later, is falling all over herself trying to welcome Anne Gertrude Wightt into Washington society, the same woman who told Peggy Eaton, no dice. Part of that is in spite of her being a Catholic, because being a Catholic wasn't necessarily a positive thing in 1831 in Washington. But she also comes from the gentry class of Maryland. She was from Prince George's County. And Peggy Eaton, on the other hand, was the daughter of a barkeeper or a saloon keeper. So there was a class thing there as well, and also the nature of the scandal. To a lot of people in Washington, there was no scandal. It made sense. A woman shouldn't shut herself up behind convent doors. And only a few years before this, Commodore Jones, who was a hero of War of 1812, his daughter went into Georgetown Visitation, and people said, she's so beautiful, she's so educated, she's so finished with languages and all. Why would she do this to herself? And so they kind of thought the reverse of what Catholics would think, and they kind of welcomed the idea of this liberation of this woman. Okay, so it's Margaret Bayard Smith, who's one of the women who introduces her, along with her first cousin, Marcia Burns Van Ness, and as we'll see, Dolley Madison as well. Now, here's what Bayard Smith writes to some 2 weeks before the dispensation. She says, living behind me is the Empress of Mexico, the former Empress of Mexico, Madame Anne Huarte de Iturbide. And living with her and taking care of her daughters, who used to go to Georgetown Visitation Academy, where Sister Gertrude was the directress of the academy, is Anne Gertrude Wightt. And she said, sorry, this is very hard for me to read, so I'll just try to paraphrase it. What she says is, I will visit her when she was in the convent, and once offered to let her out, tell her relatives, because she was friends with Marcia Burns Van Ness. If she wants to get out, we'll make sure she can get out of there. And she says, no, I'm here more by my inclination. Okay, this would have been many years before. Then she says, so now that she's out, I'm going to renew my acquaintance. Okay, and it's women like her, and then Dolley Madison, who you see right here. And she becomes friends with Dolley Madison, Anne Gertrude Wightt does, because she's going to take over in the Van Ness mansion after her cousin dies. Her cousin dies in 1832. She's the first woman, I believe, I'm talking about Marcia Burns Van Ness now, who's where Congress dismissed itself in her honor when they heard about her death. And so she was quite a philanthropist and a kind of social do-gooder in DC. So their house was a place that was a place of politics, just like when Dolley Madison ran the White House. It was a place of politics as well as woman's domain. Okay, and so there needed to be a social hostess, and she very quickly went from living with the Iturbides to living at the Van Ness household, to whom she wasn't blood related to anyone except for the dead former mistress there. Okay, but she ingratiated herself with the family, and so that when he dies in 1846, they all give part of their inheritance to her, so that she gets like $15,000 in land in DC, and that she can then sell. Okay, so even though, and one of the nephews later names one of his daughters Anne Gertrude Wightt Van Ness, and she's the godmother. Okay, that's in 1855, so it's a long way away. But so one of the early biographers of Dolley Madison was Alan C. Clark, and he talks about, this is where I get lots of information, just little snippets that are here and there in books like his, where he talks about Miss Anne Gertrude Wightt was the hostess in the Van Ness household. And there she became an intimate of Dolley Madison, because in 1838, Dolley Madison eats dinner at the place, and then they become fast friends, sharing books and this kind of thing. And, getting letters of introductions when Anne Gertrude Wightt goes to visit Mount Vernon, that kind of thing. Okay, so Clark quotes Mrs. Kate Carney Henry, who was a much younger contemporary or acquaintance of Wight, and said that she was the most charming person in her manners and conversation, and was sought after as an honored guest, as well on all distinguished occasions. She knew at least 3, maybe 4 languages: French, Spanish, Latin, and English, of course. Okay, I'm pretty sure Latin was another one, based on the books she had, and then also other evidence of that. So this was very important to a hostess, being able to converse in many languages, discuss literature, discuss music, that kind of thing. And this was in spite of her cloistered background. She was able to do this. Okay, so what is parlor politics? And I've used the term, and I'm quoting the historian Catherine Algar, who wrote a book, award-winning book, Parlor Politics, in which the ladies of Washington helped build a city and a government. And I really, although Algar doesn't say anything about Anne Gertrude Wightt, and she's also written a biography of Dolley Madison that I use in my class, she quotes or says, here's what parlor politics is. It's really politics that happens kind of behind the scenes or in the unofficial sphere. Today, on the golf course, when you hear about business being done on the golf course, where real deals are just sealed in the boardroom. So this is where women could have access, because as Algar says, this was politics that took place in women's spaces, such as parlors and dining rooms, during social activities usually considered private, such as calling, visiting, and dining. But politics goes on here. People like Dolley Madison would have soirees in the White House, and she would introduce young men looking for a job to a to a congressman looking for a secretary, that kind of thing, and do it in a bipartisan or even nonpartisan fashion, so that both sides could say, "Oh, she's great," And I think because of her connection with people like Dolley Madison and the other 2 women I talked about, and others, Anne Gertrude Wightt took to this very easily. If anything, what happened is she was already doing this to some extent as directress of the academy and the assistant superior in the convent. She was like the liaison to the outside world, arranging people like John Quincy Adams to come and speak at their distribution at the end of the year, and trying to get Andrew Jackson to do it the following year to show no partisanship there. He couldn't make it, but then he made a later visit, that kind of thing. And this tradition she started continued through several presidents then, okay? So she was already doing some of this in the convent, but I think she sharpened her skills as a hostess and as a dinner guest. And really, she seems to ingratiate herself with lots of people once she meets them. And I think in a good sense, she seems to honestly like people and trying to do for others as well as for herself. Now, Alexander Gardner, the brother of Julia Gardner Tyler, the second wife of John Tyler, writes about one of the last dinner parties given in February 1846 before the death of John Peter Van Ness. And in it, even though Van Ness himself was a Jacksonian Democrat, the guest list was 4 Whigs and 4 Democratic senators. Okay, this would be typical of the way Dolley Madison did it as well, so that even though her husband was the head of the Democratic Republican Party and was president of the United States, when she had dinner parties and various kinds of drawing room meetings, she made sure that everybody from all sides were invited. That way she could stand above politics. And again, I can't prove that she learned this from Dolley Madison, but it seems quite likely. Again, I don't have a smoking gun to point to that, but they clearly knew each other, and this was the style that Dolley Madison made her. As one person said, "We love you, Dolley," and she says, "Well, Dolley loves you," that kind of thing. Someone who could be above politics and therefore walk that very dangerous tightrope, because women, of course, are not elected to anything. So they have to be very careful in how they use whatever influence or power they may have. Now, here is Madame Iturbide, kind of painted right around the time of her death, so it's probably idealized, but it's in Georgetown Visitation. And we're back to them because after the death of John Peter Van Ness, she, at some point, moves back with the Iturbide family and takes care of one of the daughters, one of the princesses, Isis. And before she does that, though, there's the war with Mexico, and the pension that the Iturbide family had received for the services of the father who had helped to defeat the Spanish. He was then made emperor of Mexico and then deposed and then tried to come back and executed. So in between there, the family had been voted a $1 million pension. Okay, so they still had claims to that pension, even though the father was disgraced and the family was in exile. So what happened is they were getting intermittent payments from that anyway. The war with Mexico shut that off completely. So Madame Iturbide, who lived in lived in Philadelphia by this time, meets with James K. Polk, who's the president, and serving as her translator, even though I know she could write in English, so I'm sure she understood, but she probably wanted to be able to have a translator there so that if there was some difficult thing, she could always say, well, I just don't understand this. Okay, so, and Polk points out in his diary, Miss Wightt, the niece of the late Mr. General Van Ness of this city, was there. And as I say here, the fact that Polk misspelled her name and misidentified her kinship to John Peter Van Ness suggests that she was not known to him more than socially. Okay, although his wife may have known her, because his wife was also a friend of Dolley Madison's, and they were both educated women of the Upper South. and may have found some camaraderie that way. It seems likely that Wight would have used her connection to John Young Mason, who was one of these career politicians, one of the first, had started in the lower house in Virginia, went to the upper house, then went to House of Representatives, then was named a federal judge, then became a cabinet officer, and finally at the end he's our minister of France. So he goes through the whole early republic deep state and is part of it. Okay, so he's a good friend of Polk's. He's a good friend of Dolley Madison. He's her personal lawyer, lends her money, and becomes a good friend of Anne Gertrude Wightt. He and his wife both, they have 6 daughters, no sons that I can remember. Maybe they did, but the 6 daughters become very tight with Anne Gertrude Wightt, and she always writes to them as Sister Anne Gertrude Wightt and writes to their parents as Anne Gertrude Wightt. So, so she's recapitulating a lot of the same things she did with the parents of families of girls she taught. She was the main liaison for the convent to those parents and guardians. Okay, so that's one of the things, again, why she was so comfortable, I think, in this role. And Mason was, as I say, not only good friends, but they had been classmates together in North Carolina, and Mason's going to serve in his cabinet. There he is, John Young Mason. We'll see him again. And he has a plantation down in Fortsville named after his wife, Mary Ann Fort Mason. Now, Isis Iturbide dies in 1849, and she leaves $10,000 of the $70,000 she assumes is figuring, I'm probably going to get at least $70,000 out of this million, promise. And she says, in that case, Anne Gertrude Wight's supposed to get $10,000. The rest of my family gets $55,000, and then $5,000 for her doctor. Dr. Samuel Jackson, a renowned physician, long before he became an actor for Quentin Tarantino. But he had treated her, and she had been nursed on her deathbed by the two of them. And right before she died, she writes her will. And so good. Anne Gertrude Wight's now going to be more financially independent, because that would be like, I looked it up, somewhere around $360,000 today. Okay, 10,000 if you got it. And
I mean, so far after she left the convent, she's been living as a guest.
Yes, exactly. She's been dependent on others, and that was very true about the Van Ness family. This is true about the Iturbide family. Once she collects this $10,000, she'll still be living with others, but she won't be a burden on them at all. Okay, and she'll be able to branch out. She'll come here in that circumstance. So what she does is she writes to John M. Clayton, the Secretary of State under the new Whig government of Zachary Taylor. And she says to him, she requests a special favor to bring this affair to a speedy and successful issue. Here's what she's asking for, though. That he direct the U.S. Minister to Mexico, Robert Perkins Letcher, a former governor of Kentucky, to induce the Mexican government to make a prompt exertion to pay this debt to the Iturbide family, who have resided in this country more than 20 years, and I would be greatly obliged and benefit. She doesn't even talk about the fact that, not going to receive, at least right here, she doesn't. He knows that she's also involved in that. But what I mean is, as she looks out for her own interests, she's also looking out for others, okay? And I don't mean to make her to be too Pollyannish or something like that, but I think shrewdly, in a smart way. So 3 days later, on Christmas Eve, and that struck me as kind of interesting, Clayton granted the special favor by instructing Letcher that I should be glad if your personal good offices, you could be instrumental in realizing the legacy for that lady. Okay. Pardon me?
Yeah, I'm just interested in the fact that it says for that date.
Yeah, okay. Right, okay, yes, yeah. Or maybe it's just that's the part I quoted. But here's a drawing of Robert Letcher, and she becomes tight with Robert Letcher and becomes his translator since he doesn't know Spanish when she goes to Mexico, okay? So this, upon presenting his credentials, he says, he pleads the very interesting case of an American lady, Miss Ann White, and he misspells her name twice, but he will get to know her better. The interesting thing about this too is that he's, there was a point I just want, let me just go on. He would not apply the cold term of a claim. Such a word would be appropriately employed, would not be appropriate, cannot be appropriate employed in this case. Meaning this, normally if a claim is made, it's going to be made by a guy who owns a ship because it's been seized in Mexican waters, or it's going to be traders who have wandered in the American West into Mexican territory. Very few women are going to have a claim against the Mexican government in this case, okay? He goes on to say then too that her case assumes therefore loftier ground than a mere claim and stands upon its own intrinsic merits. Above all argument, it speaks for itself. And then he goes on to have pages explaining the case he just said it speaks for itself. But he also uses this high-flown language of gender-loaded language, about talking about women in a certain kind of way that they need to be taken care of and that kind of thing. And then he goes on to talk about Anne Gertrude Wightt that way. Miss Isis Iturbide, with her mother, brothers, and sisters, were all banished from their own country. In their home, they found many kind friends, but none so constant, none so untiring, so self-sacrificing as Miss White. Wow. She gave up everything for years, devoting all her time and her little means to the use of the exiled family. And Isis lay ill for years. And then finally, just before she dies, she grants this money. So he's explaining this to one of his Mexican counterparts. And then the new Secretary of State, finally, by 1851, Clayton gives way to Daniel Webster. And Daniel Webster is engaged in some very serious negotiations that almost may lead to war with Mexico about the province of Tehuantepec, where the Americans were looking to have the rights to carry goods without having to pay any toll from the Gulf of Mexico to Pacific. And also there were companies that were looking to build either a canal through there or a railroad, because this was one of the big problems, right? Getting around Cape Horn and all of South America. So long before the Panama Canal, they were looking for better ways across. So these negotiations, though, infuriate the Mexican public. The Mexican government is not happy with it because it's just one more insult. They just lost half their country to the United States in the war. This is like, oh yeah, now we want some more, or at least we want the right to go through your country and acting like there's no barriers. So in this letter to the president of Mexico, Mariana Arista, Secretary of State, after many paragraphs talking about the tense negotiation, says, I was quite pleased with the manner in which you complied with the request of Miss White, a lady well known and highly regarded in our social circles. This seems to me a kind of example of what we talk about today as soft power, ways where you work negotiations by, the old ping pong diplomacy before you have real diplomacy kind of thing, where you can have cultural or other ways of meeting countries, and then that opens the door to more serious negotiations down the line. So a month later, the president of Mexico responds, and the same kind of very serious discussion in his letter until he gets to the point where he says, Much as Webster had done, Arista ends by referring to a matter on which the two leaders could find consensus. I have sufficient interest in the favor of Miss Wightt, he assures Webster, and will hereafter, pursuant to your wish, do everything I possibly can for her. You know, this just this strikes me as kind of interesting, right? I'm not enough of a diplomatic historian to tell you that this never happens, but I think it's much less likely to happen with women like that. Okay, so after she returns to America in 1852, she's got a bank account that's much heavier. She's collecting every 2 months. I think she was getting $1,000 from the government. So she finally comes back with $10,000, which she invests very wisely, as I can tell from her will. And when she comes back, she immediately keeps up with the Mason family. And then when Mason is appointed U.S. minister to France, she goes with the family to Paris. He's already there. She meets him, and she spends a number of months in Paris with his family. Then she comes back sometime around November. Again, it's hard to, but she is in Tudor Place in November because she's been invited to come and live in Tudor Place by Britannia Kennan, whose mother has recently died. She is the one that Britannia turns to because Britannia is a widow, her husband famously being killed in the, well, you all know this probably better than I, in the Princeton incident, one of the casualties with the peacemaker that exploded, a cannon on a ship. And she had only been married about a year and had a young child at the time. And she then retreats to this home. And she is also the great-granddaughter of Martha Custis Washington. And she had been one of the students at Georgetown Academy when Anne Gertrude Wightt was the directress of the academy. So she became very close to her, like a lot of the students did. And she went by the name there, Sister Getty or Sister Jetty. I'm not sure. I've seen it spelled J with a J, so I'm not sure how they pronounce it. But this was the kind of term of endearment that was particularly used for sisters who were well liked. So here's a picture of Britannia Kennan, Britannia Peter Kennan, because Peter was her maiden name. And she's 16 years younger than Gertrude. So Gertrude is like an older daughter or older sister to her. And this is true because she had older sisters who were also deceased. America and Columbia were her sisters along with Britannia. And so then also Britannia's only child, Marky, is somebody who refers in various letters to Anne Wightt. Okay, so it's, again, she seems to ingratiate herself. And I like to think in the best way, you know, it does seem like genuine feelings that people have about her and she for them. So through her residence at Tudor Place, Anne Gertrude Wightt also comes into contact with other members of the Peter family and the extended family, the Custises, the Lees, and the Williams families in Virginia. Again, most of you will know better than I. Then they talk about, she's cousin Britt, and there's cousin Mary Custis Lee, and cousin Robert, who later becomes real well known. This seems to me another attempt by her to find family after her own family of origin, but her parents died and she's living in the convent. That becomes her family then. Then when she leaves the convent for complicated reasons, and her sister had died in the convent. So she's really, who she got left? She's got her first cousin, who happens to be the wealthiest woman probably in Washington. She goes to her, and then at the request of the Archbishop, she moves in with a Catholic family, though. and that's the Iturbidez. And again, those daughters are somebody she's taught. She serves that kind of role. And then she takes over after her cousin dies in the Van Ness family and becomes very close to not his children, because their one daughter died and their son is already an adult, but there were nephews and nieces all over the place that she becomes very close to. So this is and finally, I think at Tudor Place, she finally finds that kind of family she's been searching for, where she can also be more on even terms, because she's not living off of anybody here, or she's not doing work like she did with the Iturbide family. And while she's at Tudor Place, she writes letters to John Young Mason, who's of course in France. And what we see is her giving him advice. She becomes a kind of political broker for him, especially when he's out of the country, and he seems to appreciate it and take it seriously. Even before that happened, though, when she was in France with them, she buttonholed him to provide a job in his law firm back in Virginia for Beddington Queen. And she didn't know Beddington Queen, but she knew his family because she's related to the Queens. The Queens I used to live on Queens Chapel Road, and that was, an old Catholic family, right? And also Joseph Queen, I think it was Joseph Queen, the doctor, was one of the people who was known as the most prominent Confederate spy in Charles County, and met with John Wilkes Booth and that kind of thing. So formerly had gone to Georgetown. So that whole Catholic connection with the conspiracy. Okay, so Bennington, she says the family is, very respectable, they've fallen on hard times. And could you find a place for this guy? This is typical of this kind of lobbying that someone like Dolley Madison did when she was in the White House, finding people jobs, but doing it in such a way that she doesn't benefit herself, but she becomes somebody who others say, oh, you want something? Maybe go to her, okay? Because she's a good place to start at least. All right, so then she also reports on political events. She seems to be very savvy about this. The stereotype of women being out of politics, of course, never is true. But she seems particularly interested. She writes to him about the Senate race in Virginia, or the governor's race in Virginia, but also the senators. And she compares the two senators from Virginia, his state. They are R.M.T. Hunter and James Murray Mason, with the senators from New York and from Massachusetts. And she finds the ones in Virginia very superior. What's happening in her own politics? You see this. They're becoming more sectional, just as the country is becoming more sectional. And so she's starting to identify not just as an American, but as a Southerner in her views. And so she's critical, particularly of Charles Sumner and Henry Wilson, two fanatics, and one of them a shoemaker. How dare he? Right? And then she immediately responds and say, "Oh, I'm not saying that shoemakers shouldn't be senators, but yes, she is." Because she says, but I don't think the views they expound would be taken seriously. Okay, so Henry Wilson was also a know-nothing before he was Republican, so that's kind of interesting. But a know-nothing, yeah. The anti-Catholic news party that was very popular in 1855. Then one of the things that happens in 1856, of course, is James Buchanan gets elected president, and he's immediately besieged by office seekers. And what Wightt sees it as her job is to contact Mason and get, contact Buchanan and have him reappoint John Young Mason and give him a raise too, and point out how his health isn't good and he needs some time off. So she does all that. She writes to Buchanan, or Buchanan is his apparently he pronounced it. And he explains, he says, now you see the fix I'm in. I'm new this so I don't know that I can appoint him because there's others who are here who are looking for jobs too. So then he says, but he shall not be recalled without due notice or at an unpleasant time of the year or season of the year. And so she copies all this out, the letter that she got from Buchanan, in a letter she sends then to John Young Mason and says, I thought it was, now my dear judge, if I had gone to Wheatland, Buchanan's estate, I could not have gotten anything more explicit than this, okay? And turns out he was reappointed. Now, was it because of her or in spite of her? I don't know, but it does seem like, that he dies in 1859 while in France. Now, the other people she's working hard for are the Iturbides again. But she had become very estranged from Madame Iturbide when she came back with 10,000, and the family only got about, well, they had to give 10,000 to a lawyer who worked it all out. So the family got about 45,000 out of the deal. Okay. Madame Iturbide was very upset with the U.S. minister and said, she should give it all to us. And apparently, Gertrude Wightt, in this case, didn't agree. But she remained friends with some of the daughters, and in this case, the son, Angel Iturbide. He married a woman from Maryland or from the D.C. area, and I'm trying to remember where, and I don't recall right now, but she was, it too, Alice Green, the Greens family, and they were pretty prominent family. I mean, she had governors on her side, governors of Maryland, Revolutionary War heroes. She was not accepted by Madame Iturbide because she wasn't good enough for his son. But she and Angel are also going to pursue that $1 million that the family is supposed to get. And so here we have a quote from a correspondence that I found in the Iturbide family papers in the Library of Congress. I looked at them on microfilm, and I noticed that a clerk had put nothing of insignificance in this correspondence because it's between these two sisters. And of course, this was probably 1966, I think, when he wrote that. And of course, there was no women's history as such or anything like that. This is just women's stuff. So they write to each other. Maria Green Devereaux, who's much older, appears, than her sister, who's about 19 when she marries. So she would have been about 23 or 24 by 1859. We agree with you that in thinking that Miss Wright has influence and therefore hope she will exert it in our favor. Okay. The correspondence between Alice Green Iturbide and her sister Maria Green Devereaux is particularly revealing about how Miss Wright interceded with dignitaries on behalf of the Iturbide clan. Alice writes to Maria, "Let me, however, conclude by saying that unless Mr. Lewis Cass, Secretary of State, instruct Mr. Robert McLean, Minister to Mexico, to act with great zeal, the thing had better not be launched at all. Might you not speak to Miss Wright on the subject? What do you think? Act according to your judgment." And there is Secretary of State, the new Democratic Secretary of State and U.S. Minister, and she has access to those people too. She has access to the George Washington Riggs because he was the one who arranged the money for her to get, so the Riggs Bank. She knows people, okay, and people start to know she knows people. So finally, Maria's reply demonstrates that Wight not only provided the Green Sisters with access, but also tutored them on the most effective way to present their case to the State Department. I saw Miss Wight, writes Maria, and sorry, that's right in the middle there, and I don't know what. She considers it obligatory to know the exact amount of the sum, the origin, and the date of the claim before it can be placed, even in an informal manner, before our government, as before Mr. Cass can instruct and he must be fully informed. She is so practical and so successful in what she undertakes that she must understand what she advises. Yeah, in other words, they're looking back how successful she was in getting, finding her way to get her full money. And the big difference there is what they're looking for is a kind of recommendation from the federal government. Angel Iturbide is the legate or the legation in DC. He can't really have the American government working for him as head of as a official in the Mexican government, but he's looking for some kind of reference. Okay, that's what they're looking for. So they get it, but the problem is the timing too. Maybe they would never receive the money, but the timing is right on the cusp of civil war here and a civil war in Mexico. And they, as far as I know, the Iturbide family never collects on this. Now, one other thing though, the child of these two, they give him up to Maximilian and Carlotta to become the emperor. And in Mexico. And then when that fails, he comes back and he spends time at Georgetown University, or Georgetown College at the time. Yeah, it's very, these weird connections. Okay, one last thing about Anne Gertrude Wightt then. As I said, she doesn't really remain a practicing Catholic, but she doesn't really become formal anything. She's kind of very American in that way, kind of goes to church with people when, excuse me, I'm supposed to be back here. She goes to church with people when they're, she's visiting them. And she still goes to Catholic church when she visits Catholics, and she goes to Protestant churches, or especially Episcopal churches, when she visits mostly Episcopal friends. So that's what we have here. Marky Williams, who had a long correspondence with Robert E. Lee, that Williams family from Virginia. She was born at Tudor Place, apparently, and she comes back periodically. And when she does, they go to St. John's in Lafayette Square, she says, on her birthday. I went there to St. John's in the morning with Aunt Britt, Marky, Kate Upshur, and Miss Wight. The following week on Easter, they go back to the same church. Okay. So the Van Nesses were pew holders and in the original St. John's when it was built. And I think it's quite possible that when she took over the hostess duties from her cousin, part of that was simply, attending church with the family. And I don't think there was ever a rejection of Catholicism so much as a drifting away from it, because so many of her friends were Episcopalians. And the two aren't, what is Episcopalianism? It's kind of like, especially high church, because it's like Catholics without the Pope. So, okay, so here's St. John's. But then the main church that, as people here would probably know, that the Peter family attended, and they were pew holders at Christ Church in Georgetown. And Mary Mitchell, the local historian, says this was where most Southern families, if they belonged to any church, were members there. It was known as the Secesh Church during the Civil War. Okay, and there it is. And here is a Christ Church attendance register for 1866. And over here, right down at the bottom, you can see, maybe you can see it, but it says A.G. Wight. And so she's attending that church. was never able to find any evidence of her being baptized or becoming a formal member, but she did. No, she did serve as a godmother to a child who was an Episcopal in 1855, and former Jesuit and an archivist for the Episcopal Church in the Diocese of Maryland assured me that neither church would have accepted the other one to be a godmother. In other words, she could not be a practicing Catholic at that point for the Episcopal Church to accept her. And if she were a practicing Catholic, they wouldn't allow her to be a godmother. Here's her tombstone over there in Oak Hill, okay? And I found her tombstone pretty much the same day, the first time I came to Tudor Place and met with then curator Grant Quartermouse. And we hit it off, and suddenly he was looking to know more about her, and I was looking to know more about Anne Gertrude Wightt's life. And so we helped each other. She attends the wedding of Markey in April 21st, 1867 to Dr. Armistead Peter here at Tudor Place, and then goes on a trip. She was, during the Civil War, I'm convinced that she was living in Union States with families, because she suddenly disappears, during the Civil War, and nothing that I can find on her. That's the big gap. And as you know, Britannia Cannon did not live the whole time in the Tudor Place either. She rented it out and came back in, I think, January 1st, 1862. But she's back eventually by 1865. And she plans a trip to Baltimore, Richmond, and Fortsville. And in Baltimore, she meets with the nuns in Baltimore Visitation Convent, some women she hadn't seen since 1831. And I thought, if this was a novel, this would be too corny, because they immediately said, please come and live with us and die with us, or go to Georgetown and do so. And she says, no, I'm fine. And she says, I've got investments, and they're horrified. This is just the last thing they want to hear about her and her investments. And she does have investments. So she then goes on to Richmond, meets with Molly Mason, who's married to one of the Andersons, who runs the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond. And she comes down with pneumonia there. And she then recovers after several weeks. And then she's planning to go to Fortsville to meet with the widow of Judge Mason. And she has a stroke and dies almost immediately. So then Britannia Cannon brings her body back, and their funeral is 2 days later. She explained all the arrangements she wanted, very simple, very non-denominational, non-sectarian Christian kind of thing. And she's buried in Oak Hill Cemetery. Now, to finish off, I checked with Oak Hill Cemetery, and yes, her cousin is there, Marcia Burns Van Ness. Peggy Eaton is there. Mrs. Eden Southworth, who wrote sentimental novels from the time, and 3 different Confederate spies, women who were Confederate spies. How do I know this? Because I have a list of 8 women of interest, and Anne Gertrude Wightt is not on the list. And one of the small things I hope that will come out of this is that she might be included in the list in the future. Okay, that's my talk. Thank you. Questions I'm willing to take on anything I've talked about, or also anything that I had to leave out of the talk tonight about her time in the convent. Excuse me. Yes.
Was Georgetown at that time predominantly Catholic or predominantly Episcopal?
It was predominantly Southern, and there was a lot of those upper class Southerners were Episcopal, like Robert E. Lee, Episcopalian. But there was a kind of acceptance down in the DC area of Catholics because of Maryland being a Catholic enclave. And these were English Catholics too. They weren't like those Irish Catholics, like my great-great-grandfather who arrived in New Orleans fresh from the famine. So they were more accepted. They fit right in. They just went to a different church on Sunday. Okay, and John Carroll was like that too, although he was Irish. But in his early years, he tried to emphasize that we can be good Catholics and good Americans too. And he had a hard time explaining that to the Pope and to not anti-Catholics here, because both were convinced that that couldn't happen. But if there was an enclave, like if she had run away in Boston or New York, her story would have been ballyhooed a lot more. It didn't even make the papers here until finally a paper in Philadelphia, an Episcopal paper, carried a letter from somebody in Washington, D.C., who may have been her first cousin, because that person knew a lot about why she left. Okay. I was supposed to, people didn't hear that question. I was supposed to repeat it. I'm sorry. Okay. All right. Thank you. Yeah.
I found the first part of your book fascinating because of all the details you had about convent life and about the class system within convents. And
Didn't like the second half of the book.
no,
No, I know. Yeah.
But the other thing that struck me about it too was how this convent included a lot of women who were related to one another, and a lot of women who would have known her family.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
this White family had been in Maryland since the 1600s.
Right.
So
And they married Anglican and Catholic.
a lot of intermarriage.
Yes.
So in the second part, when I was reading her history about going to church and things like that, that might have been part of what her life.
Yeah, right. It's one of those things where she entered the convent boarding school when she was 8.
Yeah.
And her father was dead by then. Her uncle who had taken them in died. That's when her mother more or less insured her and her 6-year-old sister to the bishop and to the Mother Superior. And that became her home. And so I don't know that, and the nuns, most of the girls who went to school with her became nuns. It was almost like a junior novitiate, and they were mostly all Southern Maryland people. So it was, and these families would have, the Neals, the Brents, they all knew each other. And that was also, though, created tensions because, factions were created within. And so I just don't see her ever rejecting Catholicism so much as just being open to a lot more. Yeah.
And the other thing the point you made was about the Maryland tradition about it at the very beginning of the book, because of all the intermarriage between.
Right. Of where Catholics were viewed to a greater extent than they would have been in places like New York or Boston, or maybe even Philadelphia, as simply Christians who went to a different church on Sunday. They were wealthy, many of them, and that's not a very big contrast with the Irish who were coming in, or even the Germans who were coming in who were Catholic. So and actually a friend of mine who I went to high school with, he said the same thing, because he was very knowledgeable about the immigrant church. That's the church we grew up in. But this Maryland phase, it eventually gets swallowed up by the Irish. But initially, they're very prominent. And they always remain a kind of leavening agent. Yes.
I appreciate a lot of the work you've done that suggests her political importance and savvy and influence. And it seems to me that so many women who had some of this power are overlooked by historians. I think also I appreciate your work on her in the convent, because it seems to me she was really doing great things in the convent, but what she wanted to do was to Americanize it, to and the other people decided to follow the European pattern.
Yeah, I think in fact she wanted to keep it American because the unusual thing about the Visitation Order in Georgetown, it was founded before they were affiliated with Europe. It was not founded by any Europeans. And so that created both uncertainty in the minds of many of the nuns that they were living the authentic life. But others like she just embraced the American environment and even tried to change the order to be Ursulines because Ursulines took a fourth vow of teaching girls. And that was the only way the convent was going to survive, was through the tuition that came in. And they almost went under in the early 1820s because of the Panic of 1819 and the repercussions of people pulling their kids out of the school. So her goal was always to build up the school so that the convent could benefit. But others saw the clash between the two institutions because in Europe, the visitation nuns would have received money from the state. And they wouldn't have had, they did have a small boarding schools, but it didn't interfere with their mission. And so there was always that tension. And so you're right, she wanted to keep it American in many ways. And the French nuns who came over in 1829 that led to her leaving time was kind of the thing that she was trying to avoid. And because she saw the influence of these, of bringing this new influence and changing the world, the family she knew. They wanted to be a convent in European terms. She wanted it in American terms. And I wish I had stressed that more, specifically.
Well, I think the things go together. I'd like to ask you, do you think that she and a lot of other women have been overlooked by historians out of the male sense that women really aren't involved in important things?
Well, I think that the obvious answer there is yes, because how we define these things. It's the old routine of the guy looking for his keys under the lamppost, and somebody comes up to him and says, "It seems like you're looking for something. Can I help you?" And he says, "Yeah, I lost my car keys." He says, "Where'd you lose them?" He says, "I lost them over there." And he says, "Well, why are you here?" And he says, "Well, the light's better here." And that's what I think a lot of historians, where the light's better, mean where the sources are. And also the bias is when you make assumptions. And that's also true about the Catholic Church for years. I mean, nuns were just taken for granted. And Catholic historians are saying this, and I belong to a group which is dedicated to the history of a conference every 3 years called the Conference on the History of the Women Religious. And women religious is the kind of catch-all term for nuns, sisters, everything. And that's what we see when we start to include them. It's not just including them, it's having to reevaluate our thinking about the church and or politics or anything like that. It's not just squeezing them in. It's having to kind of rethink assumptions we have. And I think that's true about any group who's been marginalized in the past. We see that, in a larger sense. One of the other arguments I make is trying to mainstream Catholic history because it's taken for granted in places like Europe, but here it's always seen as kind of outsider stuff, and sometimes that was intentional by the church too. So it's a lot of those barriers are being broken down now.
It seems to me a lot of the progress of the profession in dealing with women seriously has come from the feminist movement of today.
Well, yeah, and a lot of the nuns I go to these conferences, they're more feminists than, is really interesting that way. And I have a sister who entered the convent when I was 4.5 years old, and she's still there. And in fact, she called me and gave me good luck on this tonight. But undoubtedly, that's why I was attracted to this topic. In addition to you suggesting, but I was interested in how nuns were perceived, and that's what I first dealt with. Then you encouraged me to talk about what nuns themselves experience, not just how they were viewed by others, but how they did themselves. And part of that was I used to travel to convents in Toledo, Adrian, Michigan, Toledo, Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio, where my sister was stationed, because they wouldn't station her in Chicago where we lived. That was pre-Vatican II. So I never had any mystery about the convent. And I was always stunned when I read about people who thought horrible thoughts. Yeah. Yeah. And another thing that's going on in the Catholic Church right now, I mean, among Catholic scholars, is looking into sexual abuse by priests. Because one of the reasons that wasn't done is because those attacks on convents were made, for so long. So there was a very defensive view of it. Now, since Spotlight and other things have come out, there's a need to say, hey, we've got to do this ourselves. And so this is being sanctioned, it's night and day. I mean, when I first went to Georgetown to get in, they gave me that book where I found out about it, and that was it. It was like, no, you can't come in. And that was 1981, right? Yeah, they wouldn't think of that now. Yes.
Across records, journals, diaries of Annie Gertrude Wightt, what her thoughts about proximity to politics and power and wealth?
This is another issue I have. I totaled up, I have 20 documents she wrote. Okay. The longest is a 20-page journal she kept in 1840 when she was raising silkworms. And it's one of those things that you think, how boring, and it is. But it also reveals aspects of her personality, almost like someone who would write, and talking like a self-confessional kind of diary. And so with these, the books say you're supposed to have so many mulberries for them. And I find I ordered too many, and they got, they wilted and died and all. And so she beating herself up, but then affirming that I'm going to do it better next time. And this was a popular pastime for a while there, where you could make some money, they thought. And I think that's why she was doing it, because this is some way she might be able to make a little money when she was living with the Van Esses. But what happens is there's long gaps. I have the Mason correspondence I talked about. I have like 7 letters. A letter with the Mrs. Mason, with her daughters, and with about 4 or 5 with him. And I can contrast how she writes to the different ones. A man in politics versus a wife versus a daughter, and all of that. But yeah, I started out to write an article about why she left the convent. And then I realized there's this whole other life she has, but finding sources. And the way I found sources were like those sources by Alan C. Clark or journalists from Washington who would write a paragraph about her. And then I would have to check, to see, because horribly inaccurate, and no photographs of her, no portraits of her that I could find. And nobody even agreed, was she short and stout or tall and willowy? So yeah. So a lot of this is flying blind. And what I said, though, that gave me hope that I could still do it was I've used in many classes a biography of Tecumseh, the Indian war chief, who left no written records. Everything is written about him. So what I did was supplement it with a lot of people who did know her, who wrote things about her, and then, try to weigh those. But yeah, the contrast is, a friend of mine recently published a biography of Mother Ann Seton, right? The first American native-born saint. And they have 3 volumes of her correspondence that they put together. So in a way, she's almost got too much to deal with. And I had a little more than Tecumseh, but so, okay.
Is there any online?
You talked about it a little bit, but somebody did ask, could finances have played a large impact on why the girls were being sent to convent boarding schools?
Finances did not seem to be that much of a problem for that family because it was her father and her older uncle took them in, and he was very wealthy. Their family was well off. They had 11 slaves in the 1800 census. And that's another thing. She never lived in a community, in a home, didn't have enslaved labor, even in the convent, because women came in and their dowry was often slaves. Okay, so Georgetown had slaves. But her aunt was the one who was the mother of Marcia Burns Maness. So there was a lot of money kicking around there. But I think what happened was the mother disappears after she puts her kid into school in 1807. And I think she was probably in bad health too. And, but finding sources, it's so hit and miss. And it's so much fun when you find something, though. Like I found records in the State Department of her trip to Mexico. That was a fishing expedition. And I go, wow, they're here. And, so you can know, I'm sure there was stuff, but what survives? Yeah.
Thank you, Dr.
Okay, thank you.